Hello, everyone. I'm Samantha Carlin, your host, and welcome to this week's episode of Samantha Politics, your source for global politics with a feminist lens. We also look at pressing international and domestic issues as well. Tonight's show is going to be about immigration. We're going to look at the history of immigration in the United States and try to understand why there's such a backlog of immigration cases within the US system and what we can do to change it. We have two amazing guests waiting in the wings as usual, and I'm really excited to bring them on. If you are watching this show and you like it, you can also support us now on Patreon, and we'll put that link, patreon.com/SamanthaPolitics1, and become a member and get more benefits with our show. But let's get down to business. So before we talk about the immense backlog in the US immigration system today, I want to do a little bit of a history deep dive to figure out who have we excluded when and why. So in 1790, the Naturalization Act of 1790 allowed, I love this language, any free white person of good character who has been living in the United States for 2 years or longer to apply for citizenship. I am unclear why they said it was of good character, who and how exactly that was determined, but that was the first act that we put forward. In 1820, there were huge waves of Irish and German immigrants. This was between 1820 and 1863. For those of you who are Irish descendants, you may have remembered the potato famine, where 1 million people starved to death in Ireland, and another million fled the country, including to the US. Also during that time, there were a lot of German immigrants that came as well. In 1849, America's first anti-immigrant party, the Know Nothing Party, forms. I also think that's hilarious. Does that mean that they didn't know anything? Maybe that is why they named it the Know Nothing Party. But the Know Nothing Party was formed as a backlash to all of these immigrants. In 1907, we limited Japanese immigration. Oh, excuse me, let me go back. And in 1883, there was the Chinese Exclusion Act. Why was there the Chinese Exclusion Act? Because there was the perception on the West Coast that the Chinese were taking jobs. Even though there was no proof to that at all, the Chinese Exclusion Act limited Chinese from coming to the country. That was in 1883. And then you have 1880 to 1920, you have Jews that were leaving Europe to escape anti-Semitism. Now, if you could throw up that slideshow, Zach, of my family. So I would love for you to meet my great grandma Molly and my great grandfather Sam. They were both from Poland. My great grandfather Sam came here at 15 years old because of anti-Semitism in Europe. He was sick of being called names and persecuted. He came over. Molly also came over from Poland. They met here. They had 5 children, including my grandma. And hooray, I am here today. The sad part of the story, though, is that Sam's father and some of his other relatives came over at one point to the US, or they didn't get into the US and they ended up back in Poland. What happened to them? Every single one of my relatives that remained in Eastern Europe was murdered in the Holocaust. We actually don't even really know where or how they died, but they were murdered at some point in the Holocaust and essentially vanished. So that's what happened when Jews were not permitted to come to this country. They were killed. And so that's something that's really important to know and to think about, is that many people come to this country fleeing violence, and when they have to go back, they might not make it out alive again. So if we look at 1910, an estimated, this is astonishing, 3/4 of New York City's population was made of immigrants and first-generation Americans. If you ever go to the Lower East Side, the Tenement Museum is a fascinating look at immigration and at immigrants in the Lower East Side, where most of the US's fashion used to be made. About 70% of US clothing was made in the down on the Lower East Side back at the turn of the century. In 1924, the Immigration Act of 1924, we limited immigrants allowed into the United States yearly in nationality quotas. Now, under this quota system, we issued immigration visas to 2% of the total number of people of each nationality in the US at the 1890 census. really confusing, but essentially it was saying, okay, we want people that we already have, which I don't really get. So Northern and Western European countries were the favorite. Now, going back to Nazi Germany, there was a conference basically called the Evian Conference as Nazi Germany was putting all the restrictions. There was Kristallnacht. The Jews were starting to wear stars, and people were realizing the situation is getting really bad for Jews in Europe. So what happened? There was a conference called the Evian Conference that brought together 32 countries and said, who will take the Jews? So really interesting fact here. There was only one country that stepped up to take any Jews. Not a country you might expect. It was not the United States. It was the Dominican Republic. And the reason that they wanted Jews was because Jews were white, and they were hoping that as Jews came in and married in, that it would whiten the color of the Dominicans. Kind of a sick reason. At least they took some Jews. We even rejected 20,000 Jewish children that the Senate rejected them, that there were people that were willing to take these Jewish children into their homes, and the Senate said, no thanks. Most of those children probably died in the Holocaust in a grotesque way in the gas chambers. So then let's go into the Cold War. During the Cold War, the US was actually taking a lot of people fleeing Soviet countries because it was part of our foreign policy status. It looked good to take people fleeing the Soviet Union. Come to us, we are the beacons of democracy. Come into our open arms, like get away from the communists. So it was actually part of our foreign policy. We took a lot of Jews from the Soviet Union. We also took a lot of Hungarians during that time. Then you see Fidel Castro in Cuba. So there was an operation called Peter Pan, which was also anti-communist, where about 14,000 unaccompanied children fled Fidel Castro's Cuba for the United States. Now, let's go to today. Trump, you might remember at the beginning of his administration, banned a certain number of Arab countries from coming into the country, saying that they were sources of terrorism. There also has been severe violence that's been plaguing Central America since the 1980s, when the US supported dictatorial regimes, also because they were anti-communist. Zach, you can do that next slideshow. And this was a time where the government was essentially attacking their own people and disappearing and murdering all of these people because they were anti-governments that we in the US supported. Makes a lot of sense. Over the years, and our guests will explicate this more, this has turned into gang violence, domestic violence, civil war, and also just no opportunity, leaving thousands and thousands and thousands of people trying to come to the US to flee violence or to have a better life. I think it's important to note, too, that it's not just Central American immigrants that are looking to get into this country. There's also Daniella, who's going to be on the show in a bit, and I went to the Fletcher School, and we had lots of people who we went to graduate school with who are fabulous, brilliant, intelligent, multiply educated people, and they could not get visas to stay in the US, and they all went back to their home countries because it was so hard to get work here. So not all of them, but a certain percentage of them could not get work here, even if they said that the visa would be sponsored by their company. It still doesn't mean you can definitely get into the country. So that's important to note. So what happened also under the Trump administration? There was anti-immigrant sentiment of basically, we don't want you, don't come in. The other thing that happened was something called the Remain in Mexico policy. And that's where asylum seekers, so if you're seeking asylum, you're looking to flee violence, asylum seekers were said, instead of waiting in the US for your asylum case to process, you have to go back to Mexico. And Mexico, usually they were in an extremely dangerous situation, and actually they are. So that policy was reversed by the Biden administration, but then it was reinstated by a lower court. So that policy is now back in effect, the Remain in Mexico policy, which has put people back into the danger that they were trying to flee from. The other thing that happened that was notorious under the Trump administration was the separation of children from their families. You might remember those horrible pictures of children literally being ripped out of their parents' arms and being put in detention centers as young as 18 months old. And nobody kept track of whose parents were the parents to which child. So when the Biden task force started to try to reunite them, the records were barely there. So that's another thing the Biden administration has done, is establish this task force to reunite families. However, Zach, if you could put that graph up, we have the largest number of pending cases in US history in the immigration courts, around 1.6 million. And you can see how it's been going up over time. And even worse, the length of time for those with open immigration cases in order to try to get a decision determining their legal status is now almost 5 years. 5 years of waiting to find out what's going on. Essentially, the slowest system ever. Okay, so I want to go and just dive into our guest. Our first guest is Daniella Burgi-Palomino, who I was lucky to have as a colleague and friend at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts. She's the co-director of the Latin America Working Group since 2019. She's been working on transnational advocacy and campaigns related to human rights in Mexico and Central America, migrant rights, and border issues. She was the first coordinator of the Funders Alliance, the Central America and Mexico Migration Alliance. She was a Fulbright and a program associate at Oxfam. She's done research around organizational strategy, organizational advocacy strategies on issues such as transitional justice, migrant rights, gender, and internal displacement. All right, so Daniella, I'm going to bring you in. Hi, Daniella. Thanks for coming on the show.
Hi, Samantha. Thank you for having me.
It's lovely to see you. So I want to actually start by asking you where you're from. I talked a little about the history of my family and how they came here. Can you tell everyone about you?
Yeah, sure. So I'm also have a direct immigration experience. I'm the proud daughter of immigrant parents from Peru and Switzerland, and I grew up in New York City. So very much the heart of, a lot of the history that you were talking about, a lot of the immigrant history. So originally from New York, born and raised there, but very much grew up triculturally.
How cool. Super, super interesting. Peru and Switzerland. I love that combination. So we are 1 year into the Biden administration. Or excuse me, has it been a year? I'm losing it. Yes, it's been 1 year, right?
Yeah, just over a year.
Thank goodness it's not been more than that. It's been, I'm terrified of the next elections. So what are some of the most important policy changes that you have seen happen under the Biden administration vis-a-vis immigration?
Yeah, so I think, by and large, President Biden during the campaign really campaigned on a policy of being different from Trump on immigration, on wanting to recognize the importance of immigrants and their contributions to the US. And he made a number of promises during his campaign that he would restore access to asylum at the border, that he would support a pathway to citizenship for the undocumented, including the Dreamers and other temporary protected status beneficiaries. That he'd reunify families, that you were just talking about, the many families that were separated under the Trump administration, and that overall he'd have sort of a less harsh enforcement approach to immigrants living in our communities in the U.S. And I think going into, where we're at now is that some of those actions have happened, but certainly not all. And I think from an immigrant rights perspective, we do think that there's some areas where he's kind of fallen short. And really at this point, we would have expected much more progress.
So can you outline, Danielle, what exactly are the areas that you feel like, he's fallen short and where you'd like to see action happen?
Yeah, so I think some of the biggest challenge currently right now, and where we've seen less progress and a continuation of the Trump legacy of cruelty and inhumanity, is really at the border, at the US-Mexico border. And so we have a situation at the border right now where, more than a year into the Biden administration, we're seeing the continuation of two Trump era policies. One of them, you mentioned, the Remain in Mexico MPP policy, which, to President Biden's credit, on the second day that he was in office, he did end. He set in place a process to process all those people that had been impacted by that policy. And so from February through June of last year, we saw up to 13,000 asylum seekers that had been impacted by the Remain in Mexico policy, MPP, forced to wait in Mexico, actually coming in and being able to take on their asylum cases from within the safety of the United States and within the safety of their family members. But unfortunately, there was a court order that is now forcing the Biden administration to re-implement this policy. Um, and so while, they have this court order, the Biden administration has sort of gone above and beyond what the court ordered them to do, which was sort of just re-implement the policy in good faith. They've actually expanded who that policy applies to. So under the Trump administration, it was really just for Spanish-speaking asylum seekers. Now the policy can apply to anyone arriving at our border from the Western Hemisphere.
Wait, I want to stop you for 1 second. So I'm just understanding what you're saying. So you're saying that the Biden administration reversed the policy, and then it was re-implemented by another court, and now it's been expanded. The definition's been expanded by who? Is it the administration, or is it?
Yeah, it's the administration. So basically, when the administration was forced to re-implement this policy, it didn't have to go that far in re-implementing it, and it could have kept appealing that order. But instead, what we saw was that very quickly it started negotiating with the Mexican government to see how it would re-implement this policy, going back on its initial promise and really expanding who the policy would apply to, even more so than under the Trump administration.
So they expanded it to include who now, or to how
anyone? That policy applies now to anyone from the Western Hemisphere or the Caribbean. Previously, under the Trump administration, it just applied to Spanish-speaking asylum seekers. So we're talking that really anyone from Latin America and the Caribbean could be forced to return to wait in Mexico for their asylum proceeding. And, it started in December. It started to be re-implemented in December. Since then, there's been about 400 asylum seekers returned, which might seem like a small number, but it's just operating along 3 points along the border so far. We expect that to be expanded in the coming months. And there's no sign that the administration is, trying to appeal the court order or maybe, taking other measures to slow down the processing of that policy unnecessarily. And then at the same time, we have this policy. We still have the Title 42 policy that has never been lifted since March 2020 under the Trump administration. And this policy is basically another way to shut the border to asylum seekers, to people arriving at our border. And under this policy, basically anyone who tries to cross the border is summarily expelled, sometimes in a matter of minutes, back to Mexican territory, or very quickly put on flights back to their home country without any sort of screening for protection. And there's been over 1 million people expelled in this way since March 2020, about half of those under the Biden administration. It's a completely unlawful policy that, flies in the face of international law. And, it has a pandemic justification.
Can you explain, Daniella, how does it fly in the face of international law? Can you explain to our viewers?
Yeah, so there's no screening. It gives people no chance to make their claim for asylum whatsoever. So like I said, people are just kind of apprehended immediately and then summarily expelled or returned back to Mexican territory. And the Remain in Mexico policy, even though we have a lot of problems with that policy as well, people eventually get a court date, even if they're waiting in Mexico, they eventually get a court date. But under the Title 42 policy, that doesn't happen. And so people are just, in very few cases, unless you're an accompanied child, which is exempt from both of these policies, there are very few cases of people actually getting processed into the United States from the border right now because of both of these policies. And, the Title 42 policy, the justification has been the pandemic. But even when it was implemented in March 2020, there was truck drivers crossing the border. There were students crossing the border. And so it was very much a singling out of migrants arriving at our border and a way to shut the door to them. And unfortunately, the Biden administration has continued that. They're actually ramping up flights. There's been, over 15,000 Haitians have been returned to Haiti under this policy just in September. There's now flights to Brazil, to Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. And just actually last week, we had the case of Venezuelans that were actually flown from the border to Colombia, a country they're not even from. So we're just not only seeing a continuation like I said, these Trump era policies, but sort of like a ramping up as
I mean,
opposed to
do
starting
you
to
think that
find
they're
alternatives.
yeah, so that's I mean, that was my second question because it seems like the reason is they're trying to deal with the backlog and it's just to ship people back without even processing asylum claims because they feel like they can't process them. So what are the alternatives?
So we think actually, the Remain in Mexico, when President Biden tried to end that policy and start processing people, right? We think that actually was a really good model for what could be happening right now, even during a pandemic. So that was a perfect example of how, through the collaboration with, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, NGOs along the border, and the U.S. government, there was a process set up to process people and make sure they got to the border, were tested for COVID, and then we're let in, right? And
Mm,
we're allowed to carry out their asylum claim from within the United States. So it is possible, and the collaboration with organizations on the ground is a key part of that. We're not saying, that everyone is going to have an asylum claim that's going to be approved. What we're saying is that there has to be a process at the border by which people can make their claim heard. And right now, what we're doing is just turning people away.
yeah, which is, again, ironic considering we are a country where, as I said earlier in my spiel, like, my relatives were fleeing violence, right? And if they weren't admitted in the 1920s, like I would never be here. I would not have been born. And I don't think people really understand that, or people who didn't leave Ireland for the potato famine. If they didn't get into America, guess what? They might have starved to death also. So I think there's just lack of understanding of what exactly people are facing. So can you explain, like, what are some of the reasons that people from Central America are fleeing?
Yeah, so I spend a lot of my time on Central America. The reality is that we're seeing people from across the hemisphere arrive at the U.S. Mexico border. It's not just Central America,
Right.
Venezuelans, Cubans, Haitians, but on Central America, we have seen for a long time a lot of factors that have been driving forced migration, since 2014, 2015, when it picked up with unaccompanied child migrant crisis. And, it still is very much gang violence, at high levels of extortion that gangs utilize to target families and individuals. We are still seeing, corruption from the governments themselves. I would say in all three countries, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, where people have just basically lost hope in the ability of their government to protect them and to act as a functioning government. The former president of Honduras, and I say former because there's just been the election of a new Honduras' first female president, but the former president of Honduras actually had ties to narco trafficking. And so this is kind of the levels of corruption that we're seeing to the highest levels in these governments. There's poverty, climate change increasingly is becoming a factor. The entire region actually suffered the effects of two back-to-back hurricanes in November 2020. And the pandemic has caused, huge impacts to the economy and increasing unemployment. So it's a range of factors. It's not just gang violence. It's also, like I said, corruption, repression by these governments. And it is a situation where all these factors kind of combine, and people really just have lost hope for the future. But many times, and I forgot to mention, of course, sexual and gender based violence
Yeah.
is a targeted kind of violence where people are fleeing from.
What would you say to those people who say that those people are entering illegally, they should be shipped back, or that they don't deserve to be here? What would you say to those people?
The reality is that people are actually trying to approach a border point of entry, many cases, and like request asylum. Um, and others then make their claim once they get into the United States. And these are people, as I said, who are fleeing cases of violence mixed in with other factors, who are really just searching for a better life or protection, really a safe place, or to be reunified with their families in the United States. And the unaccompanied migrant children that have entered the United States are thriving members of our society. So, I would say to those people that, many times people are trying to approach the border and make these claims in the quote unquote right way. But there is no right way right now at the border. I mean, there's humanitarian chaos. That's what's happening. And,
Mm.
these are ultimately members, people that grow to be members, strong members of our community that contribute to our economy and that are very much, have contributed to the fabric of this country for many years. So, um, those are some of the things that I would say. And I think, there are alternatives to welcome people at the border and to really process them so that they can eventually contribute to our societies. I think the last thing too is that, we're talking about people that have traversed countries to arrive at the US-Mexico border. And, even now I was looking, there's hundreds of Haitians at the Mexico-Guatemala border
Hmm.
who have already set up their own businesses there because they've been waiting there, are either waiting to process their case in Mexico or eventually making their way to the United States. So we're talking about incredibly courageous people who are also, very hardworking, entrepreneurial, and ready to make contributions to the United States.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Danielle. Last question for you. If the average American citizen cares about this, what can they do in order to help change Title 42? Title 42 is correct. That's what it's called, right? Change Title 42 or to take action on this. What can they do?
Yeah, so there's a number of ways you can get involved. First, I would say if you belong to a church, look, start within your own community. So wherever it is that you are in the United States, whether you belong to a church, you're very active in your school or a neighborhood association, and you have had a positive experience with, say, an immigrant member of your community, find ways to, within your associations or clubs that you belong to maybe, write letters to local government officials and talk about how you can be a welcoming community just within your own association. Secondly, I would say that if you're shocked by anything what I'm saying in terms of what's actually happening at the border right now, to make that known. If you have already had the privilege of going to the border and volunteering with organizations, write about this, write op-eds about this. You might have the opportunity to go back to the border and support a border organization. There are many that are in dire need of help. You can donate them or even maybe volunteer virtually. And lastly, we have had some members of Congress speak out about the situation at the border, but it's certainly not enough. And it's been sort of at peaks at different moments, like when we had the situation of the Haitians in Del Rio, Texas, last September. And so we do need a lot of support. To the extent that you're outraged by this, your member of Congress should also be outraged by it and be outraged by the fact that we're not living up to our values of being a welcoming country. Also, check out my organization. Tomorrow, we're actually going to have an action that you can get involved in on our website. There is a congressional letter that is still opening, and that some members of Congress are leading, actually writing to the CDC, questioning them on their rationale behind the use of the Title 42 policy and expressing concern about it. So if you want to get involved in that, check out our website tomorrow, and you might be able to get your member of Congress to sign on to that letter.
Thank you, Danielle. And what is the website for people?
lawg.org.
lawg.org. So LatinAmericaWorkingGroup.org. So you can get in on that letter and pressure your congressperson to speak out against what's happening. Awesome. Thank you so much, Daniella. I want to just thank you so much for coming on the show and also for the incredibly important work you're doing to try to have people's human rights essentially be respected. It's really, really important work. So I want to thank you for doing that and for coming on Samantha Politics.
Thanks so much, Samantha.
Good night. Okay. All right. All right. So you hear that? Get to lawg.org and you can get in on that letter to Congress to have them speak out against this policy that I frankly didn't really know even was still happening from the Trump administration. So it's really important to know that people are not having their asylum claims processed. So I want to bring on our next guest. Joshua Toll is the pro bono partner at King and Spalding, which is a terrific international law firm and a resident of the DC office. He leads the pro bono program across all King and Spalding offices firm-wide, which again, we're talking international. This is not a small law firm. He does amazing work overseeing all these lawyers that are going out there and trying to do good in the world and help people that don't have representation. I was really impressed when I first met him. Before 2013, he was chair of the pro bono committee in the DC office. And under his leadership, King and Spalding has received multiple pro bono awards and accolades, including recognition from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, the National Legal Aid and Defender Association, and the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. In addition to leading the firm's pro bono program, Josh does his pro bono work focusing on death penalty and juvenile justice, impact litigation, and civil matters in D.C. Prior to joining King and Spalding, he was a trial attorney with the Office of the Public Defender of Maryland, where he took more than 75 cases to trial in various Maryland state courts. He successfully litigated constitutional and state criminal law issues and developed expertise in negotiating favorable outcomes for clients with complex cases. He has a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy from Cornell and a JD from Harvard. Welcome to the show, Josh. Oh, I think you're still muted, Josh. I'm trying to unmute you. There we go.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me just start by saying that I'm approaching this from, as you said, from the perspective of a pro bono immigration lawyer. And I want to talk about my experience in the court system. I'm going to reference some specific experiences I've had, but of course I can't mention specific client names. So I'll just be vague about certain details or maybe change little things to protect their identities. And of course, the views I express here tonight are my own. So just wanted to put out those caveats, but thank you for having me.
Absolutely, Josh. So first question for you, I'm going to start with the same as Daniella. What's your ethnic history, identity? Where are your parents and grandparents from?
Yeah, great question. On my mom's side, my family is Italian. In fact, my grandmother was born in Italy and came here when she was 2 years old, and they settled in New Jersey, the Penns Grove neighborhood, which is also where celebrity Bruce Willis is from. And then, yeah, on my dad's side, it was a mix of English, Irish, German, and French. So a bunch of European countries represented, but certainly immigration is a very personal issue for me as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Josh. So what is going on? Why is there such a huge backlog in the system?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's a combination of factors. Certainly the surge of people that are fleeing violence in Central America has played into it. Just more people entering the system, but certainly COVID has been a big factor as well, because the court systems had to postpone a lot of cases due to suspending in-person hearings. I think some of the various immigration courts have been slower than others to adopt WebEx technology. And so they're rolling all of that out and they're trying to make up for lost time. But I think it's a lot of factors have really led to an unprecedented backlog, as you mentioned. And I just want to take a moment to talk kind of about the real consequences of that. You mentioned that immigrants have to wait, 5 or 6 years for their hearing. And we're actually seeing that play out in practice. We have clients who are claiming asylum, seeking asylum. And yeah, they're receiving court dates in 2025. And that's incredibly difficult because, number one, it makes it more difficult for them to prove their cases 3 years from now, 4 years from now, 5 years from now. Memories have faded, documents are no longer available, witnesses passed away. A lot of things can happen. And then secondly, many immigrants will have put down roots in that time. They may have children who are then U.S. citizens by virtue of being born here. Some of them may marry U.S. citizens and be able to adjust status that way, but others won't have that option. But they're going to have a life here. They're going to start a life here, and then to have to go to court in 5 years to present their claim, which may not be successful. I think it raises a lot of really, really basic fairness issues.
Thank you so much. Can you share a story of one of the clients you've represented and what the circumstances were of their case?
Yeah, absolutely. I thought it might be helpful if I just touch on a few, because we do have a broad-based asylum and immigration practice at King and Spalding. Our work is nonpartisan, non-political. Our goal is to represent people, immigrants who can't afford to hire a lawyer. This is our way of giving back. So we're really trying to help as many people as we can. And it's really one of the big factors, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, is the fact that there's no right to representation in immigration court. So if you can't afford to hire a lawyer and you're not able to find an organization like Catholic Charities, for example, that may be able to represent you pro bono, and there's some great ones out there, you are going to have to represent yourself. And that's really unfair because the immigration system, as you know, is quite technical. And so we're trying to help as many people as we can. There's a lot of great pro bono lawyers out there at other large law firms, large, small, and medium, large firms law firms as well that are doing the same thing. But we've done everything from asylum cases to representing unaccompanied minors who come into this country. We do DACA work. We help DACA recipients with DACA renewals. We help victims of...
Can you just explain what DACA is in case anyone doesn't know?
Yeah, sorry. That's deferred action for childhood arrival. So these are people who came here as children to the United States with their parents in an undocumented status, but they've now lived here continuously for quite a long time. They're now adults, and this is really the only country in most cases they've ever known. And so the Obama administration put out this program which allows, with certain conditions, you have to not have a serious criminal record, you have to have a job, or be in the military, or be pursuing your education. So there are a number of factors that you have to satisfy to get DACA status. And it's not an actual citizenship status, but it does allow you to stay here. But you have to renew your DACA status every 2 years, which is quite burdensome. So we do that work, and then we represent victims of trafficking, victims of domestic violence, and we also help people who have been here legally apply for green cards. But yeah, I would just want to touch on a few stories.
Sure.
We have a DACA recipient who, despite doing his best to maintain employment, had to experience extraordinary medical expenses for his elderly mother who was undocumented, because the Obama administration also rolled out the DAPA program, which was for parents, but that was struck down by court. So the parents of the DACA recipients often are undocumented. This particular DACA recipient was in a position where he could not afford the filing fee. It's a $500 filing fee every 2 years, which is non-waivable. Many of the immigration different forms you can file for a fee waiver, but you cannot do that for DACA renewals. And so we had to help him get charitable assistance. Otherwise, he would have lost his DACA status. And having to do that every 2 years, $500 is a very significant barrier to people who have DACA. Absolutely. Yeah. I also want to talk about a young woman we represented who did come into this country when she was 15. She was fleeing sexual assault by a gang member in a Central American country. She had a father who had abandoned her and a mother who had a chronic illness and was not really able to care for her. So in addition to, fleeing sexual assault and gang violence, she really did not have a stable situation in her home country. And her story was so compelling. And yet, despite that, this government put her into removal proceedings and spent years actively trying to remove her from this country.
Wow. And what was the government's case in that situation? Why was her circumstances not good enough?
Yeah, I mean, it was really because she entered this country without inspection. And certainly there's people that will kind of debate both sides of that, but she snuck into this country because she was fleeing gang violence and was desperate for a better life. And she did have a relative here. And we were able to demonstrate that she does meet a legal program called Special Immigrant Juvenile Status, which is for neglected minors, neglected children. And so we were able to get her that status, which was great. And then we were able to get her immigration case dismissed, which is wonderful. And currently her green card application is pending, and we do expect that to be approved. So it's a great success story, but we had to battle it out for years in immigration court. And had she not had a lawyer, again, had she not had representation to be able to dot all the right I's and cross all the right T's, her fate could have been much different.
Josh, I think that's, first of all, amazing. So thank you for your work there. But also to think about, too, we're also assuming that people speak English and that they're able to. I can barely get through anything legal in English, and that English is my native language, because the legalese, my sister sent me a case she worked on, and I was like, my head was spinning. Daniella might know I did not do well in my law classes at Fletcher. I did really well in my diplomacy classes, but the law classes were like, yikes. So, that assumption, too, that people are going to be able to navigate that on their own is just unbelievable.
Absolutely. Completely agree.
Josh, so why do we have, you were a public defender. We have this system of federal defenders and of public defenders at the state level. Why do we not have defenders for immigration and for asylum seekers?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's really because immigration is civil. Even though the consequences of deportation, as you pointed out, you may be sent back to a country where your life is very much at risk. So really the stakes couldn't be higher, but we've had a policy in this country, for a long time. Of course, you've heard of the Gideon case, right to counsel in criminal matters. Those are obviously deemed to be a kind of a higher level of interest because your liberty is at stake. And unfortunately, we haven't extended the right to counsel to indigent people in civil matters. And that can not only be deportation, but it can be eviction from your home. It can be loss of custody of your children. Again, these are life-changing events that are major events for anybody. And I think in part it's a resource issue. We haven't wanted to devote the resources, but I personally think it's vitally important. And we see this in immigration court. If you look at asylum cases as an example, the success rate for people represented versus people who are unrepresented is a night and day difference in the statistics. Having an attorney is so important to the success of your claim. You can have a very strong asylum claim, but without an attorney, you're not really going to know how to present it. And that's a huge problem.
Yeah, can we talk too about this? I mean, these photos of like 3-year-olds in court by themselves with
right.
are so ridiculous. I mean,
Agreed.
how do we expect, like, even if we had some kind of proceeding where we said, okay, we're going to give every unaccompanied minor or every juvenile access to a lawyer, because I mean, there's a 3-year-old can't even tie his shoes, right? Like,
right.
How do you defend yourself in asylum proceedings?
Right. I completely agree. If you wanted to sort of pick a place to begin, maybe you want to say as a policymaker, like, well, we can't give everyone a lawyer right instantaneously. Deciding to give indigent children an attorney, I think, would be a great first step because they are completely vulnerable and they need the assistance. And I think as a society, we need to figure out a way to do that. Now, that could come at the state level. There are some states, I know, like in Atlanta, the Atlanta Public Defender has begun representing in certain immigration cases. That could come at the federal level. There's obviously different ways to do it, but I think we need to have those conversations and figure out a way to get this done because, again, this is basic fairness.
Josh, I just want to break for a second and go to Zach. Zach, can you cue up that video, the documentary? So this is a clip from a documentary, which is about what we're talking about, undocumented, or about children representing themselves in immigration court. Can you throw up that video, please?
Are you a little nervous this morning? See? Do you understand what these proceedings here in court are all about? You know what a lawyer is? No? Do you have a lawyer? No? Sophia, good morning. Are you a little nervous this morning? See? You know what a lawyer is?
No.
No? Do you have a lawyer?
Josh, anything come to mind when you watched that video?
Yeah, I think it's accurate. I think that those exact scenes have played themselves out in this country many, many, many times. And as you pointed out, it's also a language barrier. A lot of these children have not yet been able to learn English. And so they're having to try to get an interpreter to explain to them what the judge is asking them. And then, they may be able to answer basic questions like, do you have a lawyer? But at some point, they're going to, what the clip didn't show is that you have to present your defenses to removal in immigration court. And there's obviously no way they're going to really know what those are. They may, it's in some cases, maybe be able to talk about some of the dangers they escaped. But again, without an attorney to present it in the right way, it's going to be extremely difficult.
Thanks, Josh. So another issue that we spoke about is this issue of the lack of independence of immigration judges. Can you speak a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So, of course, as you pointed out, we have a state and federal court system, and typically, the federal court system funnels up to the U.S. Supreme Court. All of those federal judges are independent in the sense that they have lifetime appointments, and they have that judicial independence. However, immigration judges don't have the same independence. They're administrative law judges. They're technically employed by the Department of Justice, which means that they don't have the same level of independence. And judicial independence is so important because obviously sometimes judges have to make unpopular decisions, controversial decisions, if that's what the law dictates. And they need to be able to resist any type of influence from the other branches. And so a lot of people have pointed out that, we really should create an independent body of immigration judges and give them more security and independence, which will, we think, lead to fair outcomes. And those proposals have definitely been out there for a while. It's been a discussion, but it's just not something we've made any progress on.
Yeah, so I think it's important to point out with regards to lack of independence that sometimes under certain administrations they're given quotas, like you can only approve this many asylum cases and you're expected to deny it. So they have somebody in front of them, they're like, well, quota's up, sorry, get out.
I think the quotas more recently have been more about how you have to handle this many cases per day or per week or per month in terms of the processing times. But of course, that is very difficult because some cases are more complex than others. And, basic principles of due process dictate that you have to be entitled to fully present your case, however long that takes. Some people may have one witness, some people may have 10 witnesses, but whatever you have to be able to present it. And a judge under a strict time quota is not going to be able to thoughtfully adjudicate your case. And again, that's simply not fair.
Yeah, it's absolutely not. Another thing that we spoke about was the discretion of immigration authorities to deport or not deport. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it's come up, we talked about a little bit earlier in the show with regard to ICE enforcement priorities. So I think those have changed somewhat recently, where people who pose a national security risk or have serious felony convictions have become enforcement priorities over just someone who's, yes, undocumented, but has been living here for a long time and has not broken the law. For example, the parent of a DACA recipient has maybe lived here for decades and has not broken the law. That person would no longer be an enforcement priority in terms of being arrested by ICE. But there's also discretion in a different way, which is that as the clip mentioned, the government always has a lawyer, which is a lawyer from the Department of Homeland Security. And they have discretion to close cases or to dismiss cases based on the interest of justice. And a lot of advocates, really have pointed out that they should be using their discretion a lot more than they do.
Wait, sorry. I'm going to stop you, Josh. I'm just trying to understand. They can close them in the interest of justice to who? What is I don't know, who determines justice there?
Right. So they, as the Department of Homeland Security, they initiate the case. They start the case in immigration court by issuing a charging document called a notice to appear. And ultimately, the case will be decided by a judge if it goes that far. But they also, because they can bring cases, they can also dismiss cases. And there are situations where, let's say, for example, you have 1 year to claim asylum. Let's say you missed your deadline for various reasons. You were ill, you didn't have access to resources. You may have a great case, but there may be some technical defects. such that a judge may decide, you know what, I'm sorry, I can't give you asylum. I'm going to have to order your removal. That's a case where the Department of Homeland Security could decide to just dismiss the case. And that's called prosecutorial discretion because they're prosecuting the case. And we really want to encourage them to do that because
Sorry,
yes,
so you're dismissing the prosecution of this individual for deportation.
Exactly.
Got it.
Exactly.
Okay, I just wanted to be clear.
Right. And, we have an adversarial system, that's true, but the government should be trying to achieve justice. And there may be people that have excellent reasons and really deserve to stay here, despite not technically meeting the asylum claims, whereby the government could exercise discretion to allow them to stay. And that also would do a lot to address the backlog, because some of those cases could be resolved short of actually going to trial, and that would work on the backlog.
So if we dismissed a bunch of these kinds of these cases, then it would get rid of some of the cases that are kind of clogging up the immigration system that are kind of not really necessary because they haven't committed a crime, and are probably working. There was also something, and we didn't talk about this before, but I wonder that the U.S. has always said that they'll give citizenship if you fight in the military. I mean, that's been, ages and ages and ages. And yet I've heard of a lot of examples where people have served in the military and they still can't get their citizenship. Have you had any experiences with that at all?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we have DACA clients who have served in the military, and they're not getting citizenship. There's no pathway for them currently. And, I think the Biden administration has tried to put together a framework and sent it to Congress, which really, I think politically has not, the Senate's just not going to go through. But I think there's some really good reasons to, if you wanted to start with one group, the DACA recipients themselves, offering them a pathway to full citizenship, I think makes a lot of sense. And right now that does not exist.
So essentially the DACA recipients, if I'm getting this correct, they have to pay a refiling fee every, was it 2 years? 2 years of $500 to stay DACA, but there's no pathway to actually become a citizen. You're just in this kind of limbo. Is that
Exactly.
right?
That's exactly right. Now you do get a work permit. You get a work permit, which is important, but you don't have all of the other, rights that you would have as a citizen.
Yeah. You know what? Just, I always find this so intriguing and stupid. This idea that a lot of people here that are here illegally, they want to work. They are working. And they are working. And so the only reason they're working, quote unquote, under the table is because they don't have a work permit.
That's right.
And if they had a work permit, they would be happy to pay taxes to America because it would enable them access to jobs.
Absolutely.
It's
completely
just,
agree.
I don't understand. It's like, when I was living in Spain, I was looking at, getting a job in Spain, and I was like, oh, I don't have a visa to work here. Just kidding. I can't work.
Right.
Had I had a visa or a work permit, I could have worked there and given money to the Spanish economy vis-a-vis, a portion of my income. But because I'm not Spanish, I can't work. Right. It's similarly there or in the US.
Absolutely. Very similar.
Yeah. So are there any other stories of people you represented that you kind of want to reflect on?
Yeah, absolutely. We represent victims of trafficking, and oftentimes they've been through really horrific events. Could be sexual trafficking, could be forced labor trafficking. And, we had a case fairly recently of our client having been trafficked by a distant relative who offered her the chance to seek out educational opportunities in the United States in return for doing some domestic work as a nanny. But when the client got to the United States, there was no opportunities for education, and rather basically treated as an indentured servant, as a slave inside the household, not allowed to leave, had to surrender her passport. And, this person had to live in these awful conditions for multiple years before finally being able to escape. And like many trafficking victims, it took her a long time to come to terms with what had happened. At first, she just wanted to get as far away from that situation as possible. And she went to the other coast in our country. But over time, with the help of therapy, she was able to talk about what had happened and start to come to terms with the trauma she had been through. And we have a program for trafficking victims called the T-Visa program, which is based on law enforcement cooperation. We want to encourage victims of trafficking to come forward so that we can prosecute the traffickers and end these awful practices. But our client, it's not unusual for her to have taken as long as she did. It takes a long time. But the government found that essentially she had waited too long, that she was now no longer here on account of her trafficking. Yeah, it's true that she had gotten married and had a couple of children, but she still was very much dealing with the impact of her trafficking and afraid to go back to her home country because that's where the traffickers lived. And so for this government to say that, no, we're not going to give you this status, we're not going to issue you a T visa because you waited too long, was a very technical reading of the law that in our view kind of flies in the face of the actual trauma that trafficking victims have to endure. And so again, more humanity needs to be brought to these cases.
Yeah, I think it's important just for our viewers to kind of know that for a long time, and in a lot of countries, it's still like this, trafficking isn't even, it's not even recognized. It's seen as prostitution. And for a long time, that was, when Josh is talking about having law enforcement to get the traffickers, for a long time, people were scared to come forward because if they had been in sexual slavery, they could be arrested for prostitution. So a big shift in the legal system of many places was trying to appreciate that these women were not only women, but these people were coerced into sexual activities on behalf of a pimp or a trafficker. And so we started to train our law enforcement to look for signs of trafficking versus just assuming that they were prostitutes and putting them in jail, which also then means they have a criminal record. And if they try to get out of trafficking situation, but they have prostitution on their record, then they have a really hard time getting a job. So it's whole cyclical thing. So that's what we're talking about in terms of trafficking. And also trafficking can take the form of sex trafficking, or it can take the form of labor trafficking. But what Josh is talking about in terms of people being promised, work in X country, and we'll pay your fee to get to America or wherever it is. And then you get there, they take your passport, and then they say that you owe them money for your plane ticket.
Right.
So you have to work for them for, however much time in order to, or, which could be a sex slave, in order to repay that ticket. And then you're so emotionally horribly beat up and face significant potential violence, also, especially during sex trafficking, potentially being killed by some of the people that they bring in.
Right.
So not a great situation. The other thing we talked about, I'm just looking at my notes. Why do you think, many of these migrants deserve to be in the country? Same kind of question for you that I asked to Daniella. Like, what do you say when people say, well, why are you representing these people?
Sure. I mean, a lot of things. We are a nation built on immigration, a nation of immigrants. I shared my story of my grandmother coming here, who sadly she's passed away, but she was such an important part of my life, and I think about her all the time. I miss her dearly. She had so much, and she accomplished so much here, and started an incredible family, which ultimately ended up in me. But it's not just that. We are a nation of immigrants, but so many of the immigrants that come here, as you point out, are hardworking individuals that want to support their families, that want to contribute to society, and they do that. But it's not just that. I also want to touch upon the point of we are a beacon of freedom, and it sounds like a cliche, but that is what our country is. And for people who are fleeing persecution, for example, we have a lot of clients who are LGBTQ clients, and that is why they had to leave their home countries. They were being persecuted because of being gay, as an example. And we have sort of set the tone as a country, the beacon of freedom. Like, you can, if you're facing persecution, you can come here. We have freedom of expression here. That's what our country is based on. And in order to really make that real, we can't just talk the talk. We have to walk the walk. And that means letting in refugees and asylum seekers who are being persecuted based on their LGBTQ status, persecuted on their political opinion, persecuted based on their religion, all of the above, which are all of them are integral to our history of our country. That, I think, is what we are, who we are as a country, and we have to show that through our actions. Now you're on mute, I think.
Thanks, Josh. I just want to go back to the Statue of Liberty, which is We created that, right?
Right.
We say, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door.
Right.
We're inviting people here.
Of course. I mean, we could have a whole other hour-long conversation just based on all the things that famous immigrants have accomplished in this country.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And, I do want to let you go, but to end on too, is that people become extremely entrepreneurial. If you
Right.
get to a country and they say, I started my business when I was living in Spain and was like, oh, I can't work. I'm going to start a business that is virtual and I can see people in other places instead of contributing to the Spanish economy, essentially. But you become extremely entrepreneurial because you have to.
That's right.
And
Absolutely.
so many immigrants end up, becoming entrepreneurs that employ thousands and thousands and thousands of Americans.
Right.
And so, it's not just that they're working and they have jobs. A lot of them become job creators. And like Daniella was saying, they've been through, if they can get through, the desert of Mexico or wherever it is for months trying to escape, I think they can figure out how to put up a LinkedIn ad.
Right. They've shown enormous resilience in getting here. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah. Unbelievable resilience. Josh, anything else you want to reflect on before I let you go tonight?
No, thank you. It's been a really great discussion. I look forward to talking with you further about these and other issues.
Great. Thank you so much, Joshua. And I want to thank you so much for coming on the show and giving us your insight and also in representing these people who ultimately, essentially without you and the pro bono partners, like they don't have a chance.
Thank you so much for those kind words. And thank you for having me.
Yeah, I think it's really, really incredible the work that you're doing. And I really admire it.
Appreciate it.
Oops, sorry. Didn't mean to cut you off there, but thank you so much, Josh. All right, so that was Joshua Toll. He is the pro bono partner at King and Spalding. And before that, we had Daniella Burgi-Palomino, who is the co-director of the Latin America Working Group, talking about immigration reform and how can we change the system to be more humane. And also talking about, have we left our roots as Americans, as immigrants, by shutting all of these people out? So if you liked this episode, I encourage you to share it with your friends. You also hit that subscribe button on YouTube to be notified the next time that we're live. But please feel free to share this. Get involved. If you care about immigration rights, write your letter of Congress. Volunteer for one of these organizations. Also, Spanish translation, that's really important. If you do speak Spanish, there's a lot of organizations that need translators to translate from Spanish to English, especially on the border. So that's really important if you have Spanish skills to utilize those. There's so many things you can do to show that you care about these issues. And the last thing I kind of want to say is that, there are a lot of places, like under the Trump administration, he said, we're full, don't come in. There's a town in North Dakota that has a population of one person. She is the librarian. She is the mayor. She is the police chief. Okay. There are places in the US that have essentially become literal ghost towns or deserts because nobody's there anymore. And we need people in these places in order to revitalize the economy. There was a woman talking about how she's in South Dakota and she said, please send us immigrants. We need hardworking people here to revitalize the economy. Like, we want people. So I think it's really ridiculous. And the US is enormous. We are an enormous country and we have plenty of room and space for hardworking, resilient, entrepreneurial people. It's not like we don't have room for them. So I think that excuse is just frankly ridiculous. So lastly, again, I want to thank our guests, and I also want to thank King and Spalding, an international law firm that also does really important pro bono work. As we heard, they have offices around the world, and I want to thank their generosity in sponsoring this episode. I also want to thank Stream Inspectors Every time I say, hey, Zach, can you put up that slideshow? Zach is the main producer behind this show. He keeps this thing running and makes me hopefully look good and everybody else. So I want to thank Zach and Stream Inspectors. They are your leaders in live stream production. If you're sick of grainy Zoom webinars that nobody watches because they look terrible and everyone sounds terrible and it's boring to watch, definitely check out Stream Inspectors. They can make your next event just so much better and more interesting and engaging. And lastly, my company, Empower Global, which does diversity and inclusion training for global companies. We'll put the links to all of those in the chat. And then think about subscribing to us on Patreon. If you think these issues are important, if you care about these issues, if you want to hear these in-depth discussions, you can subscribe to us for $3 a month. $3. That's literally less than the price of a Starbucks. I think it might even be less than Dunkin' Donuts. So if you care about these kinds of issues, please consider supporting us on Patreon. That's it for tonight. This is Samantha Carlin signing off. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you on our next episode of Samantha Politics. Good night.